Kaitrin. I use they, them pronouns. I am here today to speak with you all and to introduce and have some conversations with a lovely panel. And we are going to be talking about queer mental health during and after the pandemic, although I don't know if we're quite there yet. But before we begin, I think it's really important for us to just ground ourselves and acknowledge that we are here on the unceded and unsurrendered territory of the Mi'kmaq and Maliseet people, and that these territories and lands are covered by the peace and friendship treaties. It is our responsibility to understand that these treaties were not about the surrender of land and territory, but about friendship and mutually beneficial relationships going forward. So I think that's some very important context for us as we move through this conversation as well. So thank you so much, folks, for being here today. I'm really excited about our conversation. And our panelists today we have Robert Wright, he, him. Robert is a social worker and a sociologist. We also have Tara Field, who she, her, who is a registered counseling therapist. And then we have Erica Baker-Gagnon, who is Gagnon Baker.
Baker-Gagnon, you got it the first time.
Oh, I had it the first time. Going so well there. She, they, and is a counseling therapist as well, registered counseling therapist. Yeah. Awesome. So we're just going to start today in our conversation. If maybe each of you folks could give us a little bit of context as to how you're connected to this topic. And whoever wants to start, really, we'll keep it cash.
Yeah.
Well, I am a transplant from British Columbia, born and raised in British Columbia. Did a lot of work in grief and palliative care in that province, and but was a child of the 80s and came out living in in Montreal, going to school, had an amazing experience there and got really connected with the queer community back in the day. And so it's a passion of mine to be able to support queer folk of all ages. I work with a lot of trans youth and then I'm working with a lot of in their 40s couples who are struggling with relationships during COVID, and then older queer folk who are just feeling isolated and struggling. So it's a passion of mine. It's a natural fit for me to support members of the community who, unfortunately I'm in private practice, so there is a fee associated with it, but I also have practicum students that I work with that offer free counseling, and so being able to nurture new counselors to support the community as well as supervise them and support my own clients. So, grief, life transitions, lots of transitions with COVID, with the queer community, and it's just a natural fit for me, and it brings me a lot of reward, and really I feel privileged to be able to give back to the community that supported me so much when I was younger.
Wonderful.
Great. Well, I'm in my current role, I serve as the executive director of the People's Counseling Clinic, and so we're a clinic that serves a pro bono mental health clinic that serves a lot of people who are difficult to serve within public settings and other clinical settings. And so we work a lot with people who have experienced trauma, a lot of people who have experienced violence, either as perpetrators or victims of violence, and a lot of queer folk and racialized and other marginalized folks. So, so we've been working with this population for a long time, and certainly COVID has affected people. If you think about it, COVID has been hard on everybody, but it's been especially hard for the people living on the margins.
Yeah.
So I have sort of a similar story to Tara, I guess, where I grew up in Montreal, came out there, was part of the Pride team in Montreal for about 5 years, so got most of my experience there, then ended up moving here and starting private practice here. And I'm very passionate about helping the queer community, and I'm getting more into working with youth as well. I write a lot of letters of readiness for transitions for hormones or surgeries. And yeah, very passionate about it, and agreed I was going to say the same thing, that it's the marginalized communities that are suffering the most through this, which I'm sure we're about to get into.
Yeah, yeah, definitely. And I think that's sort of a key piece that would be great for us to dive into, because we really do know that COVID really exacerbated any and all inequalities within our society. And like you said, Robert, everyone struggled during COVID. It was a very uncertain time. It was very challenging. But you know, there were different levels of supports that were available for people, and a lot of folks just didn't have access to that, right? And a lot of people thrived on that in-person connection, that connection with community, connection with queer community, right, is so important. So I think I would love to know, and I mean, we have to go back now, and it's sort of interesting, right, to be reflecting back on the pandemic. Maybe take me back to that, when we were first sort of realizing that we had to shut down services, we had to socially and physically sort of distance from folks. What did that look like for you folks in your work? How did that impact the community? What was the sort of general sense during that time?
I mean, for me, I think when the lockdown was going to be 3 weeks, everyone kind of jumped right in. So it was a Friday afternoon that they started really announcing things, and by Monday I had transitioned to all virtual sessions. So that was a whirlwind experience of trying to find a platform that you can use that respects confidentiality. So over the span of 2 days, everything was set up for virtual. So that is actually a pro, that now people can choose between in-person and virtual, unexpectedly. But I think for the first portion of that first lockdown, people were like, okay, yeah, this is hard. We'll get through it. It'll be fine. It's short term. And then as things continued further and further, that's when a lot of people's trauma started to come up in big ways, which is hard to work with virtually. That's when a lot of depressive symptoms came up, and isolation, I would say. That was the main thing that I found in the first lockdown.
I kind of had a mix. I had some clients saying, I prefer in person, I'll wait it out. It's not going to be long. I don't feel like doing online. I'll just take a break. And other people were right in line. I had already been offering some virtual, especially when, you know, the whole, I can't make it, I've got a sniffle. I'm like, okay, well, we can do it online. And that worked for some people. And so a lot of them just kind of transitioned easily. I'm very tech savvy, so it was easy for me. A lot of the, you know, listservs were hot with, I don't know anything about technology, you know, I don't know anything about technology. What can I use? And so it was very natural for me, and I'm lucky in that respect. But some clients did drop off saying they'd wait. And for me, I was in Toronto at the beginning of it all, and starting a private practice. So I'd been about 6 months in, and to get back up there and do what I needed to do to grow the practice just seemed inconceivable at that point, and I knew it was going to be a good year and a half. So then my partner and I decided to move to Halifax and be able to do remote, both of us doing remote. But some of my clients, you know, they really struggled with the isolation, and others found it a lot easier because they had social anxiety, anxiety going out. Of course, COVID just exacerbated that. But also, they're like, this is so much easier staying at home and not having to, and video's awesome. So now I'm at the point with them to try to go back to being in-person social, and that's like just all these transitions are such a struggle.
Right. Right.
Yeah. I had a similar experience when the lockdown first struck. Some people were seeing it as an opportunity. Whew, okay, oh, that's great. There's a lot of expectations.
Yeah.
It's like, okay, so people were doing that. Let's take a break. Well, I'll see you in a couple of weeks. We'll see where this goes. And as the weeks turned into months, that's when things really started to get troublesome. I think that a lot of people enjoyed, the people who were shut in with their families, many of them enjoyed that time initially. Right?
Key word there. Yeah.
But I think it was really challenging for people who found themselves, who in the real world, were connected and engaged with people who, and then once the cones of silence descended over these bubbles of people, found themselves on the outside. You know?
Yep.
And I think queer people are overrepresented among those individuals who found themselves not bubbled closely.
Yeah.
And I think that queer folk had to negotiate their way into bubbles and to define their bubbles. Here's a group of friends that I hang with. Okay, so that group is being dissected into different bubbles. And how do I connect with one or choose one?
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
And then a lot of judgments, both from inside of the community and outside of the community, about how individuals were navigating within those spaces. So I think for me, I'm a guy, I live in a household with my son and my mother and my godmother. The bubble descended and it defined us.
Right.
Right? And we had already been choosing to live together. So it wasn't that difficult. For other people, like my partner who does not live with us, then there was a negotiating into that bubble.
Right.
Right?
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
so this is
Yeah.
I don't think that was too difficult, but I can just see that for many other people who were nervous about things. I wasn't a particularly nervous COVID survivor. We were observing protocols, lots of hand sanitizers, wiping things down, all that sort of thing. No hugging, no kissing, but we allowed people to visit over there.
Yeah. Yeah.
So, but for others, I think it was very, very stressful.
Yeah.
Very stressful.
And I think within the queer community, and a lot of folks have, what I kind of like to frame as non-normative lifestyles or relationships or partnerships, right? Which you're speaking to. And for folks who may be in poly relationships or non-monogamous relationships, I know even within my own community, that was really challenging. That was really this sort of like you said, being forced to sort of pick your person, right? Like, which is it's a pretty heteronormative sort of like framework, right?
Yes.
Yeah.
Like you pick your best person, that's the person you're gonna see. I mean, it doesn't work that way for queer community, and so I really think that was challenging for folks. Were other people seeing that within sort of your practice? That was a challenge that was coming up, or other types of relationships that were strained as a result?
Yeah, I think we're talking about queer family, which is different than your traditional normative family. And so I found that a lot of my clients, and I also struggled with this, of having kids, because you have people that are family, but they're not in your bubble. And so the kids are suffering for this. They've lost their daycare, their school, whatever. And now they've also, on top of that, lost their people, their aunts and uncles, and everyone that they would normally see. So I think a lot of people had a hard time navigating that and following public health guidelines. Sort of. So yes, definitely.
One of the things that I thought, and I know Bob Strang a little bit, and I said, we'll leave him alone right now. He's kind of busy. But one of the things that we need to talk about is when this thing happens again, we need to have a chief public health officer and a chief mental health officer. because I think that so early in the pandemic, for example, I was being asked to talk to my staff about surviving the pandemic and so forth. And I went into the first one of those things. Oh yeah, okay, I'm going to talk to a staff group, and I went in there with a little PowerPoint and some tips and that sort of thing, and I wasn't prepared for the crying, for the anguish, for the distraught individuals who are saying, it's been 4 weeks since I've seen my grandkids.
Yeah.
And I think that there needs to be a message that says, let's do all we can to protect ourselves from this pandemic, but let us be kind to each other, because mental health is as important as our physical health.
Yeah.
And let us be kind to each other, because some of us will need to bend protocols in order for us to survive
Yeah.
this pandemic.
Yeah.
And getting COVID is the least of our worries. You know, there's a reason why, solitary confinement is used as a punishment
Yeah.
in prisons.
Yeah.
Because it's a way to break a person. And we needed to go into this pandemic letting people know, be safe, but don't be broken. And that message didn't get out strong enough, I
No.
think.
No, and a lot of people were saying, well, I have it better than this person. You know, I have housing. I have whatever. And so it's that at least I this.
Yeah.
You know, there's someone starving in Africa as the example that was always used when I was a kid. But it doesn't matter. That doesn't take into account your suffering in this
Yeah,
moment. And still
exactly.
people, I think, feel guilty that they're not suffering as much as others are suffering.
Yeah, a little survivor guilt there.
Yeah.
And it's sort of an interesting piece around when we look at even being able, I think we're speaking from a framework of folks being able to access your services, right? So the people that you folks are supporting, the queer folks, are the ones that got through the door, right? And so, you know, there are many reasons that people don't have access to internet or housing or even can't do that from home because it's an unaffirming environment. They're living in an environment where maybe, you know, they're not out. Their gender identity is not recognized or supported. It's dangerous, right? There's violence. So it's so interesting too, right? Because the people you're seeing are in distress,
Yeah.
but they're in the door, you know. So
And folks in remote areas, especially youth who are coming up and figuring themselves out and questioning and being in families that, you know, it's not confirming at all, and going to those activities to cope, like substance use. They're not having other outlets that they normally have, so seeing more and more substance use, video gaming, all of those behaviors that we use to distract ourselves, avoid life, they kind of have to avoid life right now because it's not there. And just being able to support them virtually when, you know, Wi-Fi's not great out there,
right.
and the privacy isn't there, that's huge. You know, they could be talking to me and someone overhearing something and they're at risk in that moment. So there's a lot of complexities in that. We want to make things better, not worse, right? And so being able to reach out to people out there, just, it's a struggle. It's just not the opportunities for that. Accessibility to our services.
Yes, for queer young people, they might have been bubbled with the most hostile people
Yeah.
to their identity.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And then I have youth who are very well supported by families, but the families or the parents don't really know what that looks like, and the services out there are really slow, and the supports aren't out there, the groups aren't out there to support the parents who are accepting and trying to be understanding and learning. So you see even the people who can access the services, and even the parents who are confirming, they have their struggles as well because of COVID. Yeah.
It was interesting, sort of this piece that you raised, Robert, around the emphasis around our physical health, right? And the
Yes.
importance of needing to be physically distanced because, you know, it was our ethical obligation to stop and prevent the spread of COVID,
Yeah,
right?
yeah.
That was sort of how it was really framed and presented. And you know, of course that's very important. But yeah, this piece around mental health and how, and I think there's always been sort of a stigma, right? There's a
Yes.
stigma around mental health.
Yes.
And it's never been on the same playing field as physical health, right?
Yeah, well, and I think that when the pandemic struck, the protocols came down hard and heavy
Yeah.
without an appreciation that those protocols would affect different peoples differently. And so the protocols were not informed by any amount of cultural competence. And we can see how COVID then made certain communities vulnerable to animosity based on their cultural approach to the protocols.
Right.
So we saw COVID come, and we saw people in the African Nova Scotian community struggling with their cultural reality to adhere to those, and then we saw stigma against the African Nova Scotian community.
Right.
And we saw COVID come, and we saw queer people struggling with those realities, and we saw additional stigma coming on the queer community, right? And that's because no one had said at the outset, these protocols will be very challenging to different peoples,
Right.
and we must be kind to different peoples, and we must understand how we will have to negotiate these protocols in order to meet people's other needs, right? So the protocols were descended as absolutes that applied to everybody without any discourse about how this is going to affect poorly housed people, how it's going to affect marginalized people, how it's going to affect people whose cultures are so dependent on community and relationships and multi-generational families and such. My mother lives with me. Do you think during COVID I disallowed my brother to come to my house? No, I did not.
Right.
Right?
Yeah.
Other people did that, but I'm a black guy. I could no more deny my brother access to his mother than I could, you know, I don't know what the analogy is, it's lost, but it would be a very severe thing.
Yeah. Yes.
Right?
Yeah.
And so, was I being a poor COVID guy? Well, screw you. I mean, you didn't implement this with my reality in mind. And I remember when Dr. Tam was responding to this, well, can you hook up during COVID? Well, wear a mask, she said. Wear a mask. Just, you know, kind of minimize the risks of COVID, but you can't give up your life.
Yeah.
I mean, if you give up your life, why are you trying to preserve your life?
Yeah.
And that's true for the Indigenous communities as well, New Canadians. You know, it's,
Yeah,
you're right, absolutely.
yeah. I mean, there's enough hatred of us in the marginalized communities enough that if we are made to hate ourselves more during COVID, you know,
Yeah.
and how far do you want to push us to the edge? Yeah. And that's not, I'm not encouraging people being irresponsible.
Yeah.
I'm saying that responsibility must be negotiated within the context of people's needs.
Yeah. Yeah.
And that those needs are not luxuries.
Yeah.
They are needs.
And they're not exceptional. I think it would have gone a long way if there had just been an acknowledgement that these measures won't work for everybody because everyone is different. But there was no acknowledgement of that. This works for white, cis, hetero couples with 1 or 2 kids. that was the people that it worked for. And that's, I mean, yes, most of Nova Scotia, but not everybody by any means.
Yeah, and it was hard for those folks, right? Not saying
Yeah.
it wasn't, but it's just sort of
Absolutely.
that piece where it's like, but what about everybody else,
Yes.
right? Who was left behind or was not considered? You know, we had these narratives around like, stay the Blazes home, right? But who wasn't considered in that? Like, what about people who don't have a home?
Yeah.
Who are, you know, who were living with friends at the time and then suddenly had nowhere to go,
Yeah.
you know? Sort of all those living on the margins, like you said, that there was just no consideration for that, and yeah, those added layers of stigma and the impact of that for the community.
Yeah.
Yeah, yeah,
But it's interesting that how exceptions could be made for the things that we recognize as important.
right.
So of course, people who drive trucks that are loaded with bread that come into, of course, we can you can get an exception, you can cross borders, you can do whatever, right? So exceptions were made for the things that majority were identified as important. And so that's why I just say there should have been, and I'm not criticizing the people who made the decisions. I'm saying next time,
Yeah.
we probably need to be around the table when
Yeah.
these decisions are being made.
Absolutely.
Yeah. And it's interesting too because we had, you know, I guess sort of like 3 lockdown periods here where it was, you know, we were really restricted in where we could go, who we could engage with. And they all looked a little bit different. And I know, you know, within my community and personally, the 3rd lockdown that we had seemed to be really a bit of a tipping point for people in terms of their ability to navigate that, you know, coping skills. I don't know, you know, this idea around like resiliency and like if it was a well, it was running dry for people. And I'm just curious because, you know, we're sort of talking about COVID then and hopefully in the, you know, what happens in the future. Did you folks see a difference in people's mental health or ability to navigate as we sort of move through these different waves and up and downs of the pandemic and sort of this, I think there was a little bit, I mean, of a promise that like, if we're just good at the beginning, right? You be good now and we're gonna be okay. Like then we're gonna open up and you know, I mean, that's just, I don't know if that was really responsible messaging because it wasn't really within our control. But like, I do think that people felt like we were good. We were good. We did what you said. We didn't see grandma, you know, we didn't see our lovers, like, and now we're locked down again, right? So just curious, like, did people sort of see, or what was the impact for folks, for the queer folks?
I think the 3rd time felt like punishment.
Yeah, the
People are
3rd time.
angry this
Third time
time.
was
It's different.
A lot harder.
Yeah, the first time there are all these memes that come out like, okay, this was the bread baking portion of this lockdown. You know, this is the time when you have all the activities planned for your kids and whatever. And this time everyone's just had it. We're all tired. We're tired of this. And then and again, not criticizing because I understand that this is a complex issue, but the back and forth of what's open, what's not open, provincially, interprovincially, internationally, what's happening, and back and forth on that. And this is impacting people's lives, right? Especially queer community. There are a lot of migrants in queer community. So there are a lot of queer transplants who come here and don't have that family who are getting ready to travel and then say, oh, nope, never mind, you can't travel anymore. Well, people are angry, and I think justifiably so.
Yeah, I think that's definitely the case. We were seeing the light at the end of the tunnel, and then boom, here it is again. And people were getting vaccinated, right? People that could get vaccinated were getting vaccinated. Yeah, we're doing all the right things. And then we go through this lockdown, and the weather as well was kind of oppressive. And then all of a sudden things start opening up again. And my clients are like, what's going on here? What's the truth? What am I supposed to do now? I'm going out, I feel anxious. And speaking of transplants, queer transplants, I have quite a few couples who have come from mostly Ontario, who one partner is out working in various, situations, environments, while the other one is at home all the time working. And just that struggle of, I'm out all the time, I come home, I don't want to talk to anybody, I've had it with the outside world, while the other one is like, I'm so stuck in here, and I'm the one, I don't have to commute, I don't have to go out, I'm the one doing all the housework. And so negotiating all these, especially with queer couples, it's not like, traditional couples where you kind of know your responsibility. So there's a lot of communication breakdown and a lot of frustration, and a lot of anxiety, and they have nowhere to go, right? So they feel stuck. And now they're coming out of that, like mending. I mean, this is going to take a very long time to recover, not even recover, that's like way too hopeful, of being able to kind of restore a sense of balance and normalcy and whatever that looks like for people again. And then just, what's been experienced, you can't unsee it, you can't unexperience it. So a lot of fixing to do, a lot of mending and healing through this. And then there's, I work in grief. There's so many families that couldn't just not see grandma, but couldn't see grandma die. And the long-term, lifelong implications of that, with my work especially, and how that spreads out to other aspects of life, relationships, and behaviors, it's going to take a long time to heal and to resolve those issues.
It's kind of reminds me of, how you cut down a tree, you look at the rings, and the rings will tell you something about each year. So this ring, if we think of ourselves as a community, as a society, the COVID ring will have implications going forward. Right? So
Exactly.
what will this last year and a half do to the people who were born in February of last year? So who spent the first year and a half of their life in a COVID reality? What will it do for those folk who started school in this year, right? COVID will have had a developmental long-term impact on everybody, and especially those who were in a formative state, right? Who were in a formative and critical state in the last year and a half. And we can think about kids who are under 8. This is going to be really dramatic for them. Kids who started junior high school during this period of time, kids who were graduating during this time, kids who were starting university during this time. Can you imagine? I especially think of queer kids who were kind of in their home communities, just holding on. Next year, I get to go to university. I'll be able to be who I can be. And then you get announced, you'll be doing university this year from your bedroom. Those kids are like, what? I was just holding on.
Almost free, yeah.
Right?
And there's no end in
Right?
sight. You don't know when it's going to end.
Yeah, and I think we underestimate how powerful that first opportunity to be away is, especially for queer kids, most of whom are not raised within a queer culture, right? So what will that have what impact will that have on folk developmentally going forward? We don't know. I think sociologists will be studying the repercussions of COVID on us all for years and years and years to come. And hopefully we'll be working on preparing for the next one.
So I think that's exactly right. And one of the pieces that was very interesting in when COVID sort of started, I was working at Pride Health. And one of the pieces that was extremely detrimental to the community was that people who were in line or had their date next week for gender-affirming surgery suddenly had no idea when that would happen. All appointments were pushed back. even things like access to gender-affirming hormones, those, like, everything stopped, right? And yeah, like, I think, you know, when someone's surgery is postponed, just in general, if you have a knee surgery, it's very challenging.
Yes.
But access to gender-affirming care is access to survival and,
Yes.
and life.
Yes.
So, you know, I think that has been such a huge piece for people. And already we know that people are waiting 1, 2, 3 years, sometimes depending on the surgery. And then can you imagine, you know, you're almost there, you have your date, and then it's postponed indefinitely until, you know, we know that things are sorted out. And I'm just curious if that was something that was coming up a lot within the practice, your folks' practice.
I had a client whose surgery was scheduled for 1 week after that Friday. Yeah, bottom surgery, so been waiting for 2.5 years or whatever. We are still talking about that. She ended up getting her surgery 3 months later, so for 3 months it was just like a maintenance game and trying to keep her mental health somewhat stable, but you can't do anything. Even as a therapist, you can support, but what do you do with that?
No.
It's just a terrible external situation. So she finally got it. We are still talking about it most sessions.
Absolutely.
It's terrible, and especially with hormones as well. Everything shut down. That's exactly it. And then the wait started over. So if you had been waiting, now you're waiting your 6 to 9 months or whatever it was initially for hormones again when you almost had them. It was so close, and that's grief.
Yeah. Absolutely.
That's why I say chief health officer, chief mental health officer.
Yeah.
Because I think that there was a real need to recognize that some of those things, for the most critical of those clients, those delays threatened their lives
Yeah.
greater than the threat of COVID.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And it really goes to show the gaps in policy and services that we have for the community. Because perhaps it would be less of a desperate situation if that person wasn't waiting 2.5 years. If, you know, like if we had enough people in the province that were willing, and I say willing because any physician or nurse practitioner can prescribe gender-affirming hormones, if we had enough people willing to do this work with our community, but these are sort of the underlying systemic issues that are exacerbating the trauma of the community. And I think that that's, you know, a big piece, like you said, Robert, around what, like, when we're developing these protocols and policies,
Yeah.
there's no lens on that, right?
I think there's a thing here. Enough medical practitioners who are willing to prescribe, willing and able. And one of the things I'd point out is that our current system of our model for health service delivery disincentivizes people to be able to do these things. So, for example, I have constructed a career such that I do not have a private practice anymore.
Right.
I work for the nonprofit agency that I created, right? So that means I have a salary, and I can do whatever I want. I do not have to, well, I guess what I would say is our current system, we talk about the public health system, but the vast majority of physicians within our public health system are private practitioners who bill fee-for-service for what they do.
That's right.
And so if you ask them to take on a service that they have to self-educate in order to be able to do competently, we're really going to have fewer physicians who are able to do those things. Because we truly do not have a public health system. Those physicians are business owners.
Yeah.
Most clinicians who work outside of the public mental health system are business owners who, if they are not queer themselves and come to this work with a life commitment to serving queer folk aren't on their radar.
Yeah.
And they, I get referrals from those clinicians who are like, queer person came in the door after meeting with a friend. I thought I gave them your number. Well, like,
Right.
okay, so, this is a significant portion of the population that you have the luxury not to serve, because to serve them would require a little more effort on your part to serve them, and the state is not paying you to do that.
Yeah.
Right? Yeah. So I think there's some problems with our model. I mean, if we want to talk structurally, why has it been so difficult for us to maintain our mental health during COVID? Because our mental health system is not designed to be as robust and responsive as clearly our public health system has been. Kudos to the public health system. I mean, Bob Strang is a hero. Unsung.
Right.
Well, he's a sung hero now. He's got his props, and he should, right? But where is the Bob Strang of the mental health system?
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
Who rallied all of our resources, brought down all of the barriers, and ensured that every single person who was struggling in the least got all of the supports they needed during COVID.
Absolutely.
Yeah, and speaking to the whole training clinicians issue, I think so finally now race issues are being spoken about more openly on varying levels. Finally, again, I think that's great that this has happened, obviously, over the last year. Yeah,
That's right.
but queerness is often invisible, as is mental health. So now you have two invisibilities that are working against you. So as a client coming into someone's office, like you said, you don't know really. They can say they're queer affirming. You don't know that. You don't know if it's safe for you. And you have to come out every time because they don't know. It's not obvious. It's not written on your forehead. So that's another barrier to mental health that you have. And then the idea of having to go to someone to get a letter of readiness for something that you said is life-saving. Hormones are life-saving. Surgeries are life-saving for people, and not knowing if they're going to turn you away or be disaffirming of your identity.
And which isn't required. That's another, like, that's just a piece that is a roadblock that has been put in place to gatekeep access to gender affirming care. So
we live in a we live in a state in health, right, that if you're 12 years old and you're at school and you realize you're pregnant and you go to your guidance counselor, you can get an abortion without your parents' permission.
Right.
Yeah.
I'm not challenging that. I think that's where things should be.
Yes.
Why the hoops for these other services? If a clinician, identifies you as competent to make your own decisions, you should be able to get in line.
Yeah. Yeah.
And the lines for kids under 18 right now, it's about 2 years to get hormones. You may as well just wait and age out. You may as well just wait till you're 18. The wait right now to get hormones is only 2 to 3 months for people over 18, which is fantastic. Yeah. But it's just wild because if you were able to start all of these things previous to puberty, you would never have any of these issues moving forward. But we make the barriers even more stringent for the people who need these treatments more.
So structurally speaking then, COVID has been hardest for the people who have been most poorly served by our systems leading up to COVID.
Yes.
Right.
Yes.
So queer folk, black folk, other racialized folk, people who are poorly housed, poor folk, so we have structurally created their vulnerability, and then COVID strikes, and we are not responsive to the vulnerabilities that we have created.
Yeah.
And that's why I bristled a little bit. I didn't say it when you talked about resilience, because resilience tends to be a word that points us inward.
Yeah.
Why aren't you resilient, Robert? You need to build resilience, Robert. And I'm saying, if you toss me out of a 2-story window, I can be as resilient as I want to be, but if I'm landing on concrete, there are consequences. Whose job is it to put a mat under the window? That's not the guy who's falling's job.
Yeah.
So it's not just about resilience, which I think is a neoliberal construct that makes us personally responsible for our wellness anyway. It's about how, as a society, we have constructed the soft landing places for people, and how, as a society, we have kept from pushing people out of two-story windows.
Yeah.
Right.
So this is something we have to collectively own.
Yeah, and I think there's a lot of pieces there around, like, resilience is almost a commodity because some people have access to it
Yes,
and others don't.
Yeah.
yes.
Right?
Yeah.
To be able to be resilient,
Resilience
you
is for
need
privileged people.
you need access to
Yeah.
resources and supports.
Not to pick on my colleagues, but they are people in private practice.
Yeah.
So in order to access those services, and I'm sure they do pro bono work, particularly in the community and all that, that's wonderful. And Tara teaches and makes her students available for pro bono work. This is fantastic. But the folk who have most access to services outside of the public health system are people with good enough jobs that they have medical plans.
Right. Yeah.
Or people who have good enough jobs or are independently wealthy such that they can pay for service.
Yeah.
That is not the evidence of a robust public mental health system.
No. And most of the time, and this was another piece of my experience when I was working at Pride Health, is, people would be looking to access community mental health, which is, what is freely available to folks here. But they're not supporting queer folks who have experiences of trauma, who are living in an unaffirming environment, who don't want anything other than gender-affirming care, right? Who have other, challenges or issues that they're needing support with. There's no space for that there. So where are people going? Like the clinic, but there's only so much capacity one clinic has, right? We just don't have that publicly available mental health supports. And I think, personally, I really believe as we move forward, we're going to see the impact of that so much more than the physical implications of COVID because of all the points that, we've raised today.
Long haul COVID mentally.
Yeah.
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 Physical symptoms are different. But
Go ahead. No, go ahead.
No, go ahead. No, just we're so attuned to COVID's physical symptoms, but and there's also people that have had COVID and people who haven't had COVID. They have brain fog, they have short-term memory issues, they have trauma, and we need some supports in place to take care of that mentally, socially. Yeah.
Yeah, a very simple thing. How many people have had to say or have heard other people say during COVID, what day is it?
Oh, yeah.
What day is it?
Yeah.
COVID is disorienting. And again, the more isolated you are, the more on the margins you are, the more disorienting it is. And we will not snap back to our pre-COVID selves
No.
the moment we can be in public without masks. I mean, it is a return. And so we will have to emerge out of the fog that COVID has descended on us. And we can predict who will emerge first out of the fog and who will be the last out of the fog. So racialized, queer, marginalized, and poor folk may be navigating fog for a very long time to come. And so I think that there's some need for us to systematically have bright lights and go into the fog looking for them,
Yeah.
metaphorically.
Yeah.
You know, we shouldn't be leaving people to heal on their own.
So I think this is really bringing us to some important places. One of the things, and it's a visual that I've sort of come from somewhere, and I don't know exactly where it's from now, and it's probably somewhere on the internet, but this idea, you know, there was this narrative for a really long time that was like, you know, we're all in this together, right? Have you heard that a lot? We're all in this together. We're all in the same storm. And then, you know, I just sort of like keep thinking about like, okay, yeah, maybe we're all in the same storm, right? But there's some people in yachts. There's some people in, you know, like, you know, dories, right? Some people in dinghies, and then there's people just treading water, right? And I think that's, I kind of keep going back to that, and we have to sort of keep thinking of that as we move forward. And just as you know, I think it might be important for us to sort of think towards the future, and think towards, I think the pandemic has shone a light on a lot of, for certain folks, has shone a light on a lot of the existing inequalities that maybe weren't so visible before to certain people. So I think now that we collectively are having this insight, and there'll be more studies and more research on the impacts of COVID on different demographics. How do we go forward to a post-pandemic world where we're not losing this memory of what's happened during COVID, and where we're supporting communities or building infrastructure or policy that actually is helping people to move past the trauma of the pandemic, but also the existing inequalities that were there before the pandemic even started. So I don't know, are there thoughts on that? Like what sort of things that would help us to move to a better world versus back to normal, right? Because a lot of people are like so keen to get back to normal. Normal wasn't so great for everybody.
You know, it makes me think of my grief work and the grief model that I use. It's called 5 Tasks of Mourning. And grief is how we feel on the inside, and mourning is getting our grief out, and that's the way through our grief. And there's not these stages of mourning, you know, Elizabeth Kubler-Ross isn't valid anymore. But there's tasks that we do, and they're not in any order, they're not prescribed. But the first task is accepting the reality of the change, the loss, the death. And we went through that in early COVID days. Like, this isn't really happening. This is surreal. Everyone was in shock. And then we moved through all the emotions. It's dealing with all the emotions, thoughts, physical sensations, all the reactions, internal reactions to it. And then the third task is taking care of unfinished business. And there's a lot of unfinished business in this, you know, and this is going to go on for a long time. And then there's establishing a new relationship with whatever you've lost. And we've lost so much, and it's learning to negotiate life, negotiate relationships, negotiate the world with our new knowledge, the new reality of our life. And I love supporting clients who stick with the work through it, of coming through the other end and finding new meaning, finding new normal, finding ways to improve our lives, improve our community. You know, Mothers Against Drunk Drivers and Terry Fox Run all came out of intense grief. And our spirits are so able to transform, but we need to take care of that unfinished business. And I think that's kind of where we're stuck right now. I don't have the answer to that. I do my little part. But being able to then figure out what we want our new normal to look like. And I have every hope that we can, as a society, as a world, come through COVID and support those who need it the most. And it's been so blatantly obvious through this experience. And yes, to be able to move forward with this knowledge and create a better place for the marginalized communities and queer
Yeah,
folk.
I think we have to get louder. Like, we as advocates
Yeah.
for people have to get much louder, because we were already being suppressed. Our voices were not being heard. Now I'm speaking as a queer person and as a therapist, so from a place of privilege. But we need to make sure that this doesn't all get swept under the rug the way it always has been, which is what people have been protesting for this whole time. We as the queer community also need to form a protest and get our needs met in a different way.
Yeah.
I'm not optimistic. There's this thing called convergence theory that says that the needs of the marginalized begin to be attended to when their needs converge with the needs of the majority. So, we have housed homeless people in hotels during COVID. We have allowed homeless people, we have allowed the shelters that have been created for homeless peoples and the tents that have been erected by them to remain in place during COVID, because it's in the majority collective best interest for homeless people to be well enough looked after that they do not create an infection risk for the majority collective.
Yeah.
But just in the last couple of weeks, we have seen those shelters being taken down.
Yeah.
So one of the first signs that we are emerging out of COVID is that we are stopping looking after the most marginalized.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
Yep.
And that's going to happen. All of the COVID services and extra resources and, funding for grocery store clerks who were heroes during COVID, and enhanced income assistance for people who are on welfare, all of that is going to start to evaporate, if it hasn't already, unless a significant number of people who are in that majority collective say no. Because if we leave it to the people who are most marginalized, the queer folk, the black folk, the poor folk, our voices will not be enough.
Yeah.
So for those folk who were in the most privileged positions during COVID, who were seeing these things happen, they cannot be passive now. They must say, if it was good for all of us to look after the folk on the margins during COVID, we must reorient our society to do that perpetually.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
So I'm not optimistic that will happen. What I hope will happen, though, is that those of us who are marginalized or who work closely with those who are marginalized will be so outraged that we will make life difficult for the majority collective to go back to that other place. And that requires some level of activism.
Yeah, definitely. And we're already starting to hear conversations around rent controls being removed, right? Like already, we're like, are we out of this? Yeah. Right?
No evictions during COVID.
Right?
Yeah,
okay, great.
Okay, COVID's lifting.
Yeah.
Okay,
Here
time
we
to go.
Let's get them out of here, right? Yeah,
Those
totally. Yeah.
relationships.
Yeah. And we've seen, the ability for years, there's been advocacy around guaranteed annual income. And man, that was rolled out in 2 weeks? Across Canada?
Yeah.
it can happen, you know, but it's also, like you said, so disheartening because there's been, that's not a new concept. There's been advocacy, there's been pilots, you know, and yet.
Yeah. So it's interesting. We were able to do it in response to a pandemic.
Right.
But we don't understand the need to do it in order to prevent pandemic. Right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. Just not that sort of framework. Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, and I think there is the potential, even within, to some scale, Nova Scotia. I mean, there are, you know, within the health authority, there's Pride Health, which ideally would be able to have some funding and capacity to be able to better support the community. But yeah, very under-resourced,
Yeah.
you know, not a lot of staff, not a lot of support, and then huge mandates,
Yeah.
right? And I think there's a lot of challenges ahead. We're getting to the point where it's time to wrap up. I'd just like to open the floor if there was any sort of final comments or anything that folks would wanted to share before we kind of end for today.
I would just say that I hope everyone is gentle with themselves through this, because we are about to get into a big fight for our rights and our needs, and everyone is like, well, COVID is over, so now we're fine. We're not fine. And it's okay to not be fine. It's okay to still look for that support and all of these things that we did and should have always. And we need to really rely on each other as a community, both minority community and the larger community.
Yeah, I second that. I think it's going to be a long road to getting there. And we've been through so much isolation and inner turmoil and outer turmoil that we need to give what we can. We need to be kind to ourselves and compassionate for each other while we fight.
Yeah.
While we fight for each other and ourselves in this.
Yeah. I think that it's interesting. We started this question on queer mental health during COVID and looking at individuals who are suffering, and we got to a place where we're looking at structural problems in society. And I think that part of being gentle to yourself in relationship to your mental health is to recognize that if you are struggling with your mental health, that is not a problem that just originates inside of yourself.
No.
That the society you're living in and the unkindness that you experience in it is largely to blame for the suffering you experience as a result of your mental health.
Yeah.
And so it makes sense that this conversation that started in the clinical individual would go to the structural.
Yeah.
So part of being kind to yourself as you struggle with your mental health is placing the blame for the suffering of that where the blame for the suffering of that should lie. And that's not with you. It's with a society that makes it difficult for you. And if you can kind of remind yourself of that as you're suffering, then you don't have to live with the guilt and the shame of suffering, you know? Yeah.
Well, I think that's a really nice way to end it. Thank you, Robert. Thank you so much, everyone, for being here today. I really enjoyed the conversation. I've learned a lot. It's been such a privilege. And so thank you so much.
Thank you.
You're very welcome. Thank you. And thanks to Pride.
Yep.